The chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Sinclair were a galaxy of counterfeit stars, dripping crystal light onto the city's elite. Tuxedos and silk gowns moved through the cavernous space, like schools of exotic fish, their laughter a soft, melodic current that never quite reached Dr. Eris Thorne. She stood near a marble column, a ghost at the feast, the cold weight of a champagne flute her only anchor in a sea of ambition. Tonight was the annual Metropolitan Architecture Guild Awards, a night she had once dreamed of attending as a celebrated peer. Now, she was here to accept a consolation prize, the Pioneers' Grant for Urban Renewal, a token gesture so transparently pity-driven it felt more like an indictment than an honor. It was her first public appearance in 5 years. 5 years since the Meridian Tower, her father's magnum opus, and her own inaugural project, had collapsed into a nightmare of steel and dust, taking 77 souls with it. 5 years since the name Thorne became a synonym for failure, for hubris, for death. The master of ceremonies for the evening was Julian Vance. Of course. It was Julian, the city's self-appointed savior, a real estate mogul whose charisma was as tall and unassailable as the gleaming skyscrapers he erected. He moved across the stage with the predatory grace of a panther, his smile a weapon of mass distraction. His company, Vance Consolidated, had not only survived the Meridian disaster, which they had co-developed, but had somehow emerged stronger. Positioning Julian as the stable hand needed to guide the city's skyline forward. David Thorne, Eris's father, had taken the fall, his reputation and his life imploding in the aftermath. Julian had delivered the eulogy at his funeral. Eris watched him now, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. He was a master of the room, his voice a rich baritone that wrapped around the audience, making each person feel as if he were speaking only to them. He announced awards with practiced warmth, his anecdotes charming, his praise seemingly sincere. And then, he came to her category. "And now," Julian began, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Eris, a flicker of something cold and triumphant in their depths. "The Pioneers' Grant. This year, we honor an architect whose journey is a powerful lesson in perseverance." A polite, scattered applause rippled through the ballroom. Eris felt 100 pairs of eyes turn toward her, a mixture of curiosity and morbid pity. She forced her legs to move, her steps measured, and even as she ascended the small staircase to the stage, the light was blinding. Hot. Julian met her at the podium, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin cool. He leaned in, his voice a silken whisper meant only for her. Though the microphone picked up the seemingly benevolent words, "You look well, Eris. Time has been instructive." He turned back to the audience, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder, in a gesture that looked protective, but felt like a cage. "Dr. Eris Thorne," he announced, his voice booming with manufactured magnanimity. "Some of you may remember her work on the Meridian Project, a tragedy that taught our industry and our city a harsh but necessary lesson about the forces we command." The room went still. The mention of Meridian was a flagrant breach of social etiquette. A bomb dropped into the middle of the polite affair. Eris could feel the air thicken, the collective intake of breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Julian smiled, a slow, deliberate curving of his lips. "But Dr. Thorne is a testament," he continued, his voice dropping to a somber, inspirational tone, "to the idea that even from the most unstable foundations, one can rebuild." The insult was a masterpiece of cruelty. To the ignorant, it sounded like a tribute to resilience, To the few who knew the truth of the disaster, the whispers of cut corners, of rushed inspections, of substandard materials supplied by a subsidiary of Vance Consolidated, it was a public twisting of the knife. He was calling her father's work, her legacy, an unstable foundation. He was reminding her, and the world, that she was born from ruin, and he was the one who had risen from the ashes. She had to stand there, paralyzed in the spotlight, and accept it, to react, to protest, would be to cause a scene, to confirm the whispers that she was unstable, broken by the past. Powerlessness was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. She forced her face into a mask of placid gratitude, a quiet dignity that was the only weapon she had left. Her gaze met Julian's, and in that fleeting moment, stripped of the audience and the pretense, she saw the raw, unvarnished truth. He was enjoying this. This was not a careless remark. It was a calculated act of dominance, a reminder of who held all the power. He handed her the sleek, acrylic award. It was cool and heavy in her hand. She stepped to the microphone, her throat dry. The silence of the room was absolute, expectant. They were waiting for her to crumble. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the seismic turmoil within. "I am honored to accept this grant. It will be used to build things that last." She held his gaze for one beat longer, a silent declaration of war he was too arrogant to recognize. Then she turned, descended the stairs, and walked back to her lonely column, the counterfeit stars of the chandeliers blurring into a cold, indifferent glare. The applause was hesitant at first, then grew, fueled by relief that the awkward moment had passed. But for Eris, the moment wasn't over. It was a beginning. The humiliation, sharp and public, had cauterized a wound that had festered for 5 years. The grief was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, something colder, something with an edge. Eris's apartment was a sanctuary of minimalism and order, a stark contrast to the chaotic ruin of her public life. It was a small loft in a converted warehouse district, with exposed brick walls and a single, massive arched window that overlooked the industrial arteries of the city rather than its glittering skyline. Here, among clean lines and muted colors, she could control her environment. Her drafting table, a vast expanse of polished maple, was the room's altar. It was covered not with blueprints for skyscrapers, but with plans for a small, free clinic in the underserved neighborhood of Atherton. This was her life now, small projects, pro bono work, a quiet penance for a sin she hadn't committed. After the Meridian collapse, no reputable firm would touch her. The name Thorne was radioactive. So she had retreated, honing her skills in the shadows, her brilliance confined to community centers and park renovations. Her name always carefully omitted from the final credits. The acrylic award from the gala sat on the corner of her desk, an alien object of polished contempt. She stared at it, Julian's words echoing in the quiet of the loft. Unstable foundations. He had branded her, publicly, with her father's alleged failure. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Elias Croft, her former professor and her father's oldest friend. He was a man whose gentle, stooped shoulders seemed to carry the weight of decades of architectural history. His eyes, magnified by thick glasses, were filled with a familiar, weary concern. "I saw it online," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He carried a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread and roasted garlic. "The award ceremony. That man has all the subtlety of a wrecking ball." Eris managed a thin smile. "He's nothing if not theatrical." "Elias." "He's a monster in a bespoke suit," Elias corrected, setting the bag on her small kitchen counter. What he did to you on that stage was unforgivable. He paused, his gaze softening. How are you? Heiress truly. I'm fine, she said, the word tasting like a lie. It was just words. Words are never just words. Not from a man like Julian Vance. Words are his weapons of choice. Elias sighed, pulling a worn wooden chair up to her drafting table. He looked at the plans for the Atherton Clinic. This is beautiful work. Your father would have been proud. The mention of her father was a familiar ache. David Thorne had been a titan, an architect who believed buildings were living things, extensions of the human spirit. The Meridian Tower was to have been his masterpiece, a soaring testament to innovation and grace. Eris, fresh out of her doctoral program, had been his lead structural engineer. She remembered the energy of the project, the long nights spent with her father, poring over schematics, the shared dream taking shape in steel and glass. Then came the collapse, a catastrophic failure during a topping-off ceremony. The tower had pancaked, floor by floor, in a horrifying cascade of destruction. The official inquiry, heavily influenced by Vance Consolidated's army of lawyers and PR experts, had laid the blame squarely on a fatal design flaw in David Thorne's cantilevered supports. They called it Thorne's Folly. The media narrative, spun with surgical precision by Julian, painted her father as a reckless artist who had ignored safety warnings in his quest for aesthetic glory. David Thorne, broken by the public shame and the weight of 77 deaths, had retreated into himself, dying of a heart attack less than a year later. A heart attack, the coroner had said. But Eris knew he had died of a broken heart. She was left with the wreckage of his legacy and the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Julian built his empire on my father's grave, Eris said quietly, her voice a low thrum of controlled anger. He was the primary material supplier. He pushed the construction schedule. He cut the budget, but his name came out clean. While ours... She trailed off, gesturing around the quiet loft, a world away from the gleaming towers she was meant to be building. Elias nodded grimly. I know. David told me he was under immense pressure. Vance threatened to pull funding if they didn't accelerate the timeline. He used cheaper steel composites from a new, untested subsidiary of his. But we could never prove it. The records vanished. The key witnesses were paid to disappear. He thinks he's won, Eris said, her gaze drifting back to the window. Across the city, the newly completed Vance Tower, Julian's triumphant middle finger to the sky, pierced the clouds. It stood taller than any other building, a monument to his power. He was a beloved icon, the man who rebuilt the city's confidence. He chaired galas, funded hospitals, and had the mayor on speed dial. He was untouchable. He has won, Aris, Elias said gently. And the best thing you can do is live your life. Build these wonderful, important things. Don't let him occupy any more of your mind. Eris looked from the plans for the small clinic to the distant silhouette of the Vance Tower. Elias was right. Of course. It was the sensible path. The safe path. But as Julian's cruel, smiling face swam in her memory, she knew that the safe path was no longer an option. He hadn't just insulted her. He had come for her, to remind her of her place in the story he had written. He had poked a sleeping bear, assuming it had lost its teeth. She picked up a stylus, her hand steady, and made a minute correction to the clinic's foundation plan. It was a subconscious, symbolic act. He had called her foundations unstable. She would show him what it meant to build something that could never be torn down. The first move came a week later. It was as swift and merciless as she should have expected. Aris was on site at the future location of the Atherton Clinic, a derelict lot that the community board had fought for years to secure. She was meeting with Maria Flores, the fierce, determined head of the board, a woman who saw the clinic as a lifeline for the neighborhood. "The permits are all approved," Maria was saying, her face beaming with a hope that was infectious. "The city signed off this morning. Thanks to your designs, Aris. They even fast-tracked it. They said it was the most elegant and efficient use of a small urban space they'd ever seen." A rare, genuine warmth spread through Aris's chest. This was why she did it. This feeling of creating something good, something needed, was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was for the executive sector downtown. She answered, a prickle of unease on her skin. Dr. Thorne. A familiar silken voice purred on the other end of the line. Julian Vance. "What do you want?" Julian Aris asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I just wanted to offer my congratulations," he said, the false sincerity so thick she could feel it coat the receiver. "I heard about your wonderful little project in Atherton. Truly inspiring. Giving back to the community. It's so important." Aris's grip on the phone tightened. "Get to the point." "The point," he said, his tone shifting, the velvet glove sliding off to reveal an iron fist, "is that Vance Consolidated has been looking to expand its portfolio of philanthropic endeavors, and Atherton seems like the perfect place. In fact, we just closed on a piece of property there. A lovely, promising lot on the corner of 8th and Elm. I believe you're standing on it right now." The blood drained from Aris's face. She looked at Maria, whose smile was already beginning to falter at the sight of Aris's expression. "You can't," Aris whispered. "That land belongs to the community board. The city approved the plans." "Ah, politics." Julian sighed theatrically. "Such a messy business. You see, the city's Neighborhood Revitalization Act, which, incidentally, I helped draft, contains a fascinating little clause about private investment priority. It seems my offer to build a state-of-the-art, 1,000-unit luxury condominium with a Whole Foods on the ground floor was a bit more appealing to the city council than a small clinic. Progress. Aris. It can be painful." He had destroyed her project. Not for profit. The margins in Atherton were negligible for a man like him. He had done it for sport. To prove that he could. To extinguish the one small light she had managed to build in her shadowed world. This was because of the gala. Wasn't it, she asked, her voice shaking with a rage she couldn't contain. "Don't be so dramatic," Julian chided. "This is just business. But I will say this. It's important to know one's place. Some people build skyscrapers, and some people are meant to live in their shadow. You would be wise to remember which one you are." He hung up. Aris stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, the dead air hissing with his victory. Maria walked over, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "What is it?" Maria asked. "What's wrong?" Aris lowered the phone, her eyes locking on the distant, arrogant spire of the Vance Tower. The ice in her stomach had solidified into something adamantine and sharp. He had taken her past, her father, her name. Now he had taken her present. He had left her with nothing. And in doing so, he had made a fatal error. He had left her with nothing to lose. "He's not going to win," Aris said. The words a low, dangerous promise. Not anymore. She was no longer just David Thorne's disgraced daughter. She was an architect, a builder, and she knew, better than anyone, that to construct something new, you first had to clear the land. The legal battle was short and brutal, a public execution of what little credibility Aris had left, armed with a referral from Elias, and the last of her savings. She hired a decent, if outmatched, lawyer named Ben Carter. Ben was a man who believed in justice, but was accustomed to fighting for it in the trenches of municipal court, not in the rarefied air of corporate litigation. They filed an injunction and a suit for tortious interference. Ben was optimistic at first. "It's a clear case of malicious intent," he'd said, spreading documents across his cluttered desk. He used his political influence to override a city-approved project. A judge will see right through it. Aris knew better. Julian didn't operate in a world where judges simply saw through things. He operated in a world he had built, a world where truth was a commodity to be bought and sold. The first hearing was a slaughter. Vance Consolidated was represented not by one lawyer, but by a team of 4 from the city's most prestigious and ruthless law firm. They moved with the synchronized lethality of a shark pack. They didn't just defend Julian's actions. They went on the offensive. "Objection, Your Honor," their lead counsel, a severe woman named Eleanor Finch, would say, rising with practiced weariness. Counsel is attempting to paint a picture of personal animus where none exists. This was a simple business transaction, fully compliant with the Revitalization Act. They buried Ben in motions, in procedural challenges, in mountains of paperwork designed to bleed Aris's finances dry. But their true strategy was to attack her character. In open court, Eleanor Finch brought up the Meridian Tower. "Your Honor, we must consider the source of these accusations. Dr. Thorne has a well-documented history of professional failure. She was the lead structural engineer on the Meridian Project, the worst civic disaster in this city's history, a project whose failure was directly attributed to fatal design flaws overseen by her and her late father." Ben shot to his feet. "Objection. The Meridian collapse has no bearing on this case." "On the contrary," Finch countered smoothly, turning to the judge, "it speaks to motive. Is it not more likely that this lawsuit is the product of a long-held, deeply personal grudge, that Dr. Thorne, unable to rebuild her own career, is lashing out at Mr. Vance, a man who has done nothing but successfully and tirelessly rebuild our city?" The judge, a man who played golf with Julian Vance at the same country club, allowed it. The narrative was set. The media, catching the scent of blood in the water, ran with it. "Disgraced architect sues city benefactor." Read one headline. "Thorne's vendetta, bitter heiress lashes out." Read another. They printed old, unflattering photos of her from the original inquiry, her face pale and strained. They contrasted them with beaming shots of Julian cutting the ribbon at a new children's hospital. Aris sat through it all, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a careful, neutral mask. Inside, she was a maelstrom of fury and frustration. She was being erased, rewritten as a caricature of a bitter, unstable woman, a footnote in the grand, heroic story of Julian Vance. The final blow came when Julian's team produced a sworn affidavit from a former board member of the Atherton Community Project. The man claimed Aris had been erratic and obsessed, constantly talking about Vance and the Meridian collapse, and that he had worried about her stability. Aris knew the man had recently received a lucrative contract from a Vance subsidiary. It was a lie, bought and paid for. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again. He lectured her from the bench about frivolous litigation and wasting the court's time. As Aris and Ben walked out of the courthouse, a throng of reporters ambushed them. "Dr. Thorne, do you have a comment on the judge's ruling? Is it true you blame Julian Vance for your father's death?" She ignored them, her eyes fixed forward, and pushed through the crowd. The public humiliation was complete. She had tried to fight him on his battlefield, by his rules, and he had annihilated her. She had lost her money, her project, and the last shred of her public reputation. That night, she sat in her silent loft, the city lights twinkling with an indifference that felt personal. Defeat was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had failed. Elias had been right. Julian had won. She pulled out an old, leather-bound portfolio of her father's concept sketches. She flipped through the pages, seeing the familiar, bold strokes of his pen, the genius in his lines. He had believed that architecture was about integrity, structural, aesthetic, and moral. He had believed the truth was like a well-designed support beam. It would always hold the weight. He had been wrong. The truth didn't hold up on its own. It had to be protected, reinforced, and sometimes it had to be weaponized. Eris closed the portfolio. The legal system had failed her. The media had failed her. The entire public sphere, which Julian owned and manipulated, was a dead end. She had been playing chess, while he had been setting fire to the board. Fine, she thought, a cold clarity settling over her. No more chess. She opened her laptop, the screen's glow illuminating her determined face. She couldn't fight him as a lawyer. She couldn't fight him in the press. But she was a brilliant architect. She was a master of systems, structures, and stress points. And Julian Vance's empire, for all its gleaming towers and polished facades, was just another structure. And every structure, she knew, had a breaking point. She just had to find it. The first phase of Eris's new war was silent and surgical. She began to stalk Julian Vance, not as a person, but as a system. She spent her days in the city archives and her nights online, cross-referencing public records, building permits, corporate filings, and zoning variances. She compiled a vast, intricate map of Julian's empire, not of his assets, but of his vulnerabilities. She was looking for hairline cracks in his foundation. Her first target was Elysian Fields, a multi-billion-dollar luxury residential development Julian was planning for the city's waterfront. It was his new flagship project, and its success depended on a swift and seamless approval process. Eris, using her deep knowledge of municipal building codes and environmental regulations, began to analyze the hundreds of pages of his proposal. It took her 3 weeks, but she found it. It was a detail so small, so technical, that only an expert with a grudge would have ever noticed. The geological survey in his environmental impact report, the one that certified the stability of the reclaimed land, was based on outdated seismic data. A newer, more stringent code had been adopted by the state 6 months prior, one that would require much deeper, far more expensive foundation pilings. Julian's engineers had either missed it or, more likely, had deliberately ignored it to cut costs and fast-track the project. This was the crack. Now she needed a lever. Her search led her to Maya Singh, an investigative journalist whose byline had been appearing on a series of sharp, incisive articles about corporate overreach for an online news outlet called The Sentinel. Maya was ambitious, hungry, and wrote with a cynical edge that suggested she didn't trust anyone, especially not billionaires who called themselves philanthropists. Eris sent her an anonymous email from a heavily encrypted account. Subject A, crack in Elysian Fields. The email was concise, laying out the technical discrepancy in the geological survey, citing the specific state code violation, and attaching the relevant public documents with the key sections highlighted. It gave Maya the what, but not the who or the why. For 2 days, there was nothing. Eris felt a gnawing anxiety. Then, on the 3rd day, Maya Singh's article dropped. Vance's waterfront paradise, on shaky ground sources allege falsified geological data in Elysian Fields proposal. The story exploded. The city council, spooked by the potential liability, immediately froze the Elysian Fields permits pending a full review. Competing developers, smelling blood, began to publicly question the integrity of Vance Consolidated's work. The company's stock dipped 7 points overnight, a paper loss of nearly $500 million. Julian was forced to issue a public statement, blaming the issue on a clerical error and promising a full, transparent review. But the damage was done. His reputation for flawless execution was tarnished, and the project was now mired in a bureaucratic quagmire that would cost him millions in delays. Eris watched the fallout from her loft, a grim satisfaction settling over her. She had drawn first blood. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. Her next move was social, not financial. Julian's power was built as much on his social standing as his wealth. He was the chairman of the annual Children's Hospital Benefit Auction, the city's most exclusive and high-profile charity event. It was, as the writing style guide had suggested, a battlefield of passive aggression, where smiles were weapons and bids were declarations of dominance. Aris, using a ticket secured by Elias through an old university connection, attended. She looked the part, dressed in a simple, elegant black gown that spoke of quiet confidence, not ostentatious wealth. She moved through the glittering crowd, a phantom from Julian's past he never expected to see in his inner sanctum. The main event was the auction of the naming rights for a new pediatric wing. It was a tradition for Julian to win it every year, with an extravagant final bid, cementing his image as the city's most generous benefactor. The bidding started at $1 million. Julian, sitting at the head table, let others play for a while before entering the fray with a casual, dismissive bid of $2 million. The room quieted, expecting the usual coronation. But from the back of the room, a calm voice called out, $2.5 million. It was Aris. A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to her. Julian, from his seat on the dais, stared at her, his charming smile tightening almost imperceptibly at the edges. He saw her, but he didn't recognize the threat. He saw the disgraced daughter, not the disciplined strategist. He raised his paddle. $3 million. Eris countered immediately. 3.5. 4. 4.5. She was calm, her bids placed without hesitation. She knew from her research that Julian's personal finances had taken a temporary hit from the Elysian Fields debacle. She also knew his ego wouldn't let him lose a public bidding war, especially not to her. She was forcing him to overpay, to bleed for his own vanity. The bidding escalated. 5 million. 6. 7. The room was electric with tension. This was no longer about charity. It was a duel. Finally, at $8 million, 4 times the wing's actual cost, Eris paused. She let the silence stretch. Her eyes locked on Julian. He looked flustered, his face flushed. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer and gracefully conceded. Julian had won, but he had been made to look foolish. He had been drawn into a petty squabble and forced to pay an absurd price for his own pride. All while the city's elite watched. He had lost control of the narrative, if only for a moment. As Aris left the gala, she passed by Julian's table. He stood up, blocking her path, his face a mask of cold fury. "That was a cute stunt," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You think these little games are going to accomplish anything? I have no idea what you're talking about." "Julian," Eris replied, her voice a model of polite confusion. "I was just donating to a good cause. Isn't that what tonight is all about?" She smiled, a cool, genuine smile of victory, and walked away. leaving him standing amidst the glittering ruins of his perfect evening. She had found his vulnerabilities, his ego, and his bottom line, and she was just getting started. The deeper Eris dug, the more she realized that Julian Vance's past was a carefully curated garden, beautiful on the surface, with all the weeds meticulously buried. While investigating the chain of shell corporations that had supplied the substandard steel for the Meridian Tower, she hit a wall. The companies were ghosts, registered in offshore havens, dissolving and reforming with bewildering speed. But one of them, Apex Materials LLC, had left a faint financial trail, a series of small, regular payments made for years to a high-end, long-term care facility just outside the city, Oakshade Meadows Sanitarium. It was an odd, personal expense, buried in a web of corporate deception. Curiosity piqued. Eris decided to follow the thread. She visited Oakshade Meadows under the guise of looking for a place for an elderly relative. The facility was quiet, serene, and hauntingly expensive. While there, she managed to access the visitor logs from the period after the Meridian collapse. Julian Vance's name appeared once, a month after the disaster. But another name appeared weekly, for years. Arthur Finley. Eris recognized the name immediately. Arthur Finley had been her father's most trusted project manager, a brilliant, meticulous man who had been like an uncle to her. After the collapse, he had suffered a complete nervous breakdown and vanished from public life. Everyone assumed he had moved away, unable to cope with the trauma. But he was here, posing as his niece. She was granted a visit. She found Arthur in a sun-drenched solarium, staring out at a garden of perfectly manicured rose bushes. He was a shell of the man she remembered, his eyes vacant, his hands trembling slightly. He was lost in the fog of dementia. But there were moments, the nurses had told her, of startling clarity. She sat with him for an hour, talking quietly about the old days, about her father, about the firm. He was mostly unresponsive, humming a tuneless melody. But then, as she was about to leave, she mentioned the Meridian Tower. His eyes focused on her, a flicker of recognition, of old pain. The steel, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. David knew. He knew the steel was bad. Eris's heart stopped. What do you mean? Arthur, what did he know? Vance's boy. So much pressure. Arthur mumbled, his gaze drifting back to the window. He said he would ruin us. David had to sign off. For the girl. For Ilara. Ilara. The name struck Eris like a physical blow. It was unfamiliar, yet it felt heavy with significance. She thanked Arthur, her mind racing, and left the sanitarium. That night, she tore through the online archives of the Meridian disaster, not looking at the structural reports or the corporate filings, but at the list of victims. And there it was. Victim number 34. Ilara Vance, age 19, died of crush injuries, survived by her brother, Julian Vance. Suddenly, everything snapped into a horrific, tragic focus. Julian's obsession with structural integrity in his new buildings, his almost pathological avoidance of any mention of his own family, his quiet funding of a children's charity called the Ilara Foundation, and the flower. For years, Julian had worn a small, discreet pin on his lapel. She'd always assumed it was a corporate logo. Now, looking at a high-resolution photo online, she saw it clearly. It was a lily of the valley. A quick search brought up an old Society page article about the Vance family from before the collapse. It featured a picture of a beaming 19-year-old Ilara at her debutante ball, a corsage of lilies of the valley on her wrist. "It's my favorite flower." The caption read, "It means a return to happiness." This was never about business. It was never about greed or ambition. It was about revenge, a cold, patient, decade-long vendetta. Julian didn't just blame her father for the collapse. He blamed him for the death of his sister. He hadn't just profited from the tragedy. He had orchestrated David Thorne's downfall as a deeply personal act of retribution. And now, he was continuing that retribution with her. The revelation changed everything. The conflict was no longer a simple fight against a corrupt businessman. It was a tragic, intertwined story of two families destroyed by the same event, with each survivor believing the other was the villain. Eris sat in the dark of her loft, the glow of the screen illuminating the victim's profile. Alara Vance, smiling out from a photo taken in a world that no longer existed. For the first time, Eris felt a sliver of understanding for her enemy. It wasn't empathy. Not yet. It was something colder, the chilling recognition of a shared, unending grief. The war was no longer just strategic. It was profoundly, terrifyingly personal. Julian Vance was not accustomed to being hunted. He was the predator, the one who dictated the terms of every engagement. The Elysian Fields debacle had been a costly annoyance. The charity auction, a public embarrassment. But together, they formed a pattern. These were not random acts of misfortune. They were precise, intelligent attacks aimed at his weak points. He had his security team, a group of former intelligence operatives, investigate. They were brutally efficient. They traced the anonymous tip to the Sentinel, leaned on the publisher, a man whose company relied on loans from a bank Julian controlled, and got Maya Singh's name. From there, it was a short, easy leap to Eris Thorne. The discovery did not surprise Julian. It infuriated him. His retaliation was no longer about sport. It was about extermination. The first casualty was Maya. She was fired from the Sentinel, her career in journalism effectively over. The official reason was unethical sourcing. But the message was clear: she had crossed Julian Vance. She called Eris from a burner phone, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. "He's coming for you, Eris. He knows. He's not just trying to win anymore. He's trying to bury you." The next attack was on Elias. An anonymous complaint was filed with the university's board, alleging that Professor Croft had misappropriated grant money decades ago. The accusation was baseless. A phantom from the past, resurrected to threaten his pension and his legacy. Elias, though shaken, refused to back down. "Let him try," he told Eris. "Some of us still believe in standing for what's right." But Julian's final move was aimed directly at Eris. He fabricated a digital trail, meticulously crafted emails, fake server logs, and doctored financial records that made it appear as though Eris Thorne had been attempting to sell Vance Consolidated's proprietary architectural plans, specifically for the new Vance Tower, to a rival developer in Dubai. It was a masterful frame, a charge of corporate espionage that carried a hefty prison sentence. Eris learned about it when two grim-faced detectives showed up at her loft with a search warrant. She had just enough time to grab her laptop's backup drive and slip out the fire escape before they broke down the door. She was now a fugitive. Her face was on the evening news. Her name once again dragged through the mud. She was no longer just a disgraced architect or a bitter litigant. She was a criminal. She went underground, moving between cheap motels on the city's periphery, communicating only through encrypted channels with Maya and Elias. She was cornered, isolated, and legally checkmated. Julian had successfully cut her off from every legitimate resource. He had made her toxic. Any attempt to clear her name through official channels would land her in a jail cell. She sat in a sterile motel room, the hum of the ice machine outside the only sound, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. Julian had taken everything, just as he had done to her father. He was trying to break her. In the dim light, she looked at the backup drive in her hand. It contained all her research, her entire case against Julian. It also contained the final pieces of the puzzle she had just uncovered from her father's old digital archives, which she had been painstakingly trying to access for weeks. The truth about the Meridian, the proof of Julian's fraud. But it also contained something else, something she hadn't been looking for. A truth about her father that was far more complicated and painful. The fear was real, a cold knot in her gut. But beneath the fear, the anger that had been simmering for years was now being honed into a razor's edge. Julian had made a critical mistake. He thought that by taking away her freedom, he had taken away her power. But he had only untethered her from the rules he thought she would always obey. He had pushed her into the shadows, not realizing that the shadows were where she had been living and thriving. For the last 5 years, he thought the fight was over. Eris knew it was just about to reach its end. The city council chambers were a theater of power, all polished mahogany and solemn civic portraits. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and expensive coffee. Today was the final public hearing for the Vance Tower, Julian's legacy project, the jewel in his concrete crown. The hearing was being live-streamed, a testament to the project's significance. Every major investor, media outlet, and political player in the city was present. Julian Vance stood at the podium, a portrait of confident grace, his presentation seamless, his vision for the city's future seductive. Hidden among the press corps, seated in the back row, was Eris Thorne. With Maya's help, she had secured a press pass under an assumed name. Her hair was cut short and dyed a mousy brown, her face partially obscured by large, non-prescription glasses. She looked like just another anonymous media assistant, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. One shot. If she failed, she would be arrested and her truth would die with her in a prison cell. Julian concluded his presentation to a round of enthusiastic applause. The council chairman, a man firmly in Julian's pocket, beamed, an inspiring vision, as always. Mr. Vance, we will now open the floor for a brief period of public comment before the final vote. This was her moment. Eris stood up and walked steadily toward the public microphone at the side of the room. A security guard moved to intercept her. But Maya, from her seat, created a small diversion, dropping a bag and scattering its contents, drawing his attention for the crucial few seconds Eris needed. She reached the microphone. "My name is Dr. Eris Thorne." A collective gasp went through the chamber. The cameras swiveled to face her. The council chairman banged his gavel. "Ms. Thorne, you are out of order. There is a warrant for your arrest security." Julian held up a hand, his expression a careful mask of magnanimous pity. "No, it's all right. Mr. Chairman, let her speak. The public should see the depths of this poor woman's obsession for themselves." It was a classic Julian move, turning her presence into a display of his own tolerance and her instability. Eris ignored them both, her voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the silent room. "I'm not here to talk about the Vance Tower. I'm here to talk about the Meridian Tower." Julian's smile faltered. "I'm here to talk about the 77 people who died in it," Eris continued, her gaze locked on him. People who died because the building was constructed with substandard steel composites, steel that was supplied by a shell corporation called Apex Materials, which was secretly owned by Vance Consolidated. She projected the corporate filing documents onto the large screen behind the council, the data pulled from the drive in her pocket and sent wirelessly to a small receiver Maya had planted earlier. A web of names and subsidiary companies filled the screen, with a clear line drawn from Apex Materials directly to Julian Vance. Julian laughed, a dismissive, airy sound. Fabricated documents from a desperate criminal. You have no proof. I have the testimony of Arthur Finley, Aris said, and a pre-recorded video of Arthur, filmed during a moment of lucidity, flickered onto the screen. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. Julian Vance. He threatened David Thorne. He said he'd bankrupt him if he didn't sign off on the materials inspection. He forced him to use the cheap steel. A senile old man's ramblings, Julian shot back, his composure beginning to crack, a flush creeping up his neck. Then, let's talk about why, Aris said, her voice dropping, becoming softer, more personal. Let's talk about victim number 34. Let's talk about your sister, Julian. Let's talk about Alara. Julian froze. The name, spoken aloud in this public forum, struck him like a physical blow. The mask of the charismatic mogul shattered, revealing the raw, grieving brother beneath. You have no right to say her name, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She died because of your greed, Aris pressed, her own voice hardening. You cut corners on the steel to boost your profit margins, and your own sister paid the price. You couldn't live with that truth. So you created a villain. You blamed my father. You destroyed him to cover your own guilt. Lies, Julian roared, losing control completely. Your father killed her. He was arrogant, reckless. His design was flawed. My father was not flawless, Aris said, and her voice caught for a moment. This was the hardest part, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. He was a good man, but he was a frightened man, and he was complicit in his silence. She projected one final document onto the screen. It was an email, recovered from a corrupted server backup, sent from David Thorne to Arthur Finley 1 week before the collapse. Subject, Vance Steel Concerns. The text was damning in its complexity. Arthur, I'm concerned about the integrity of the Vance Steel. The preliminary stress tests aren't right, but Julian Vance is threatening to pull all funding and sue us into oblivion. We have to proceed. But document everything. Keep a private record. God help us. The room was utterly silent. Aris had just done the unthinkable. In her quest for justice against Julian, she had also been forced to tarnish the memory of the man she was trying to vindicate. She had exposed her own father's weakness, his failure to act, to reveal the whole, ugly truth of the conspiracy. It was this final act of brutal honesty that broke Julian. He stared at the email, then at Aris, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. He saw his meticulously constructed world imploding on a live stream. He knew Julian screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. He knew, and he did nothing. He let my sister walk into that building, knowing it was a tomb. He killed her. In his grief-stricken rage, in his desperate attempt to deflect the blame one last time, he had confessed. He had admitted his threats, his pressure, his knowledge of the faulty steel. He had confirmed everything. The chamber erupted. The chairman hammered his gavel in vain. Security officers, their expressions grim, began moving toward the podium, not for Aris, but for Julian. The camera zoomed in on his face, twisted in a mask of despair and hatred. A king dethroned in his own court, live for the entire world to see. The aftermath was a media hurricane. The live-streamed confession of the city's most beloved billionaire became the biggest news story of the decade. Headlines screamed from every screen, Vance confesses to Meridian fraud. The Tycoon and the Tower, a story of lies and revenge. Aris Thorne vindicated. As security swarmed Julian, Aris slipped out a back exit with Maya and Elias into the cool night air. The city, which had felt like a cage for so long, suddenly felt vast and open. Reporters were camped outside her loft, but Elias took her to his quiet, book-lined house on the university campus, a place of sanctuary. The days that followed were a blur. Julian Vance was arrested, his assets frozen, his empire beginning the slow, complicated process of crumbling. The corporate espionage charges against Eris were immediately dropped, replaced with a formal apology from the district attorney's office. She was no longer a fugitive, but a reluctant hero. Victory, however, did not taste sweet. It was laced with the bitterness of the truth she'd had to reveal about her father. She spent hours in Elias's study, poring over David Thorne's old journals, which Elias had kept safe for her. She read her father's words, his anguish over the pressure from Julian, his fear for the firm's survival, his fatal miscalculation that he could manage the risk, that he could contain the danger. He was not the simple villain Julian had painted, nor the perfect martyr Eris had wanted him to be. He was a brilliant man who had made a catastrophic moral compromise under immense pressure. He was human, in accepting his flawed humanity. Eris finally found a measure of peace. Her fight had not been to restore a perfect legacy, but to uncover a complex truth. And in that, she had succeeded. She reconnected with Maria Flores from the Atherton Clinic, with Vance Consolidated's influence gone. The city council had reversed their decision, and the land was returned to the community. They asked Eris to resume her work on the project, and she agreed. Building something small, good, and honest felt more meaningful than tearing down something vast and corrupt. One evening, watching the news, she saw a report on the Vance Tower. The project was canceled, its future uncertain. The half-finished skeleton stood against the skyline, a monument not to ambition, but to ruin. It was a scar on the city, just as the empty lot where the Meridian had once stood had been for years. Eris looked at the two empty spaces on the city map, one a symbol of Julian's hubris, the other a graveyard of her past. An idea began to form in her mind, not one of revenge or victory, but of reclamation, of building something from the ruins. 6 months later, Eris stood at a podium under a clear autumn sky. She was at the site of the Meridian Tower, a sprawling, empty lot that had been a wound in the heart of the city for over 5 years. Today, it was filled with journalists, city officials, and the families of the Meridian victims. She was no longer the haunted ghost from the awards gala. She was poised, her voice steady, her presence commanding. Beside her on an easel was a large architectural rendering, covered by a silk cloth. For years, this place has been a symbol of loss, Eris began, her voice carrying over the quiet crowd, a reminder of a tragedy born from greed and deceit. We can never erase that loss, but we can choose what we build in its place. She pulled the cloth from the rendering. The crowd gasped. It was not another skyscraper. It was a stunning design for a beautiful, low-lying public library, its roof a gentle, sloping green space that merged seamlessly with a surrounding memorial park. At the park's center was a quiet reflecting pool, with 77 streams of water cascading gently into it. Today, I am announcing the Meridian Memorial Park and Library. Eris said, a place for knowledge, for community, and for quiet reflection. Its funding will come from the seized assets of Vance Consolidated, and a new public trust will be established to manage it, a trust named in honor of all 77 victims. She paused, taking a breath, including Alara Vance. The inclusion of the Vance name was a deliberate act of grace, a final, surprising turn in a story everyone thought they knew. It was a statement that healing required acknowledging the entirety of the tragedy, not just one side of it. The project was met with universal acclaim. It was the perfect, cathartic end to the city's long nightmare. Eris was lauded as a visionary, not just for her design, but for her wisdom. A few weeks later, she did one last thing. She drove to the state's maximum security prison, a grim fortress of concrete and steel far from the city. She went through the security checks, the clanging gates, the long, sterile hallways. She sat down in a small, bare room, facing a thick pane of reinforced glass. Julian Vance was brought in on the other side. He was thinner, his expensive suit replaced by a drab prison jumpsuit. The charisma was gone, stripped away to reveal a tired, broken man. They sat in silence for a long moment, the hum of the facility's ventilation the only sound. Eris picked up the phone receiver. He mirrored the action on his side. She didn't speak of forgiveness or blame. She didn't relitigate the past. "I wanted to tell you," she said, her voice quiet and even. "I'm building a library on the site, and a park. There will be a plaque with the names of everyone who was lost. Alara's name will be on it." Julian didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his eyes hollow. He had lost everything: his empire, his freedom, his name. All that remained was the ancient, foundational grief that had fueled his entire life. Eris had not come here to offer absolution, but to close a circle, to acknowledge the shared human tragedy that bound them together in the wreckage of their lives. As she spoke, she saw a single tear trace a path down his cheek. It was the first sign of genuine remorse she had ever seen from him. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Eris placed the receiver back in its cradle. She stood up and walked away, not looking back. She stepped out of the prison's oppressive shadow and into the bright, clear light of the afternoon, leaving the ghosts of the past behind her, finally free to build a future of her own design.